Great. So, hello, I'm Francoise Baylis, and I'm the author of Altered Inheritance, the only book about CRISPR technology written by a woman. And I mention that because I think I've got actually different content than some of the other authors. I'm also a member of the WHO Governance Committee with respect to what should be global oversight for human genome editing. And my plan for today had actually been to share some of the highlights of that report. Unfortunately, the report is not in the public domain yet. It will be before the World Health Assembly, which is occurring at the end of the month. And so today, I'm actually going to have to provide you with a teaser rather than the actual findings. Sorry. So the first thing I want to say is the mandate given to us by the Director General is very clear. We were to look at the science of human genome editing with particular attention to somatic, germline, and heritable interventions, where the goal might be therapeutic, preventative, or enhancement, and that we really were supposed to look at this in a global context. In other words, not paying attention to specific nation states, but what might this look like globally? And you can see there were a number of things we were not tasked to address. And I mention those because some people will no doubt comment on that when they see the final report. One of the things that's really important when you're looking at global governance is to actually understand your starting point. And so one of the things that's important are the findings that were published in October of last year, looking at policy around the world with respect to germline editing. And here I'm being very specific. Germline editing is referring to what's happening in the lab. And so that's the genetic modification of gametes, so egg and sperm, precursor cells to the gametes, and the early human embryo. And what you're seeing here is that when you look at policy around the world, you're seeing a fair bit of diversity in terms of what's permitted, what's prohibited, et cetera. And this is just with respect to what happens in the lab. Now, what's really striking is how this changes when you're looking at the same science, but with the intention of reproducing. And so this is what we know right now about what is or is not permitted with respect to heritable genome editing. And so that's when you're doing the same work in the lab, but with the intention to transfer the genetically modified tissues in order to create offspring. And many of you will know we did have children born of this technology in the fall of 2018. Now, what you should notice about the maps is completely different. In fact, there's nothing here that's green. So there is no country that explicitly permits this kind of science. What's interesting is what's in gray, countries where we don't actually have relevant information, even though they were included in the survey, which means we found documents, but we don't know what it is that they would say with respect to this because of the content, and many countries that were not included in the survey for a variety of reasons. So that's what we know right now, and it's in that context that there's ongoing discussion, debate about what should perhaps stay the same, what should change, what do we need to find out about the countries that are in gray. So one of the things that's interesting in this context are the tools that the WHO has been looking at with respect to what might be appropriate. And what I want to point out to you here is that only the first three of these are what people might be thinking about traditionally in terms of governance. And really what there was attention to in this context are the many other things that we do that set up norms or expectations. And I think that this is unusual and something to pay attention to when the final report comes out. The other thing that I think is really important, and I want to draw attention to because that's my background, is what are the underlying values and principles that drive the conclusions articulated in the report. And they fall into two broad categories, procedural and substantive values and principles. And each of these gets unpacked in the report in terms of what are the commitments. And I think you'll see that that's an unusual list. And part of it is because there's a global health perspective driving our findings. Lastly, I just want to share a couple of comments with respect to work that is already in the public domain that was done by the committee, which is that early on in our work, a scientist in Russia, Denis Rebrikov, announced that he was going to replicate the work that had been done by the Chinese scientist Zhang He. And in that context, the committee gave advice to the Director General that this ought to be labeled as irresponsible, unacceptable. And the Director General took that advice and in fact issued a statement in July of 2019. The other thing that's really important is that we've established a clinical registry, and the reason for that is to say, just like you need to know what's the background policy information, you also need to know what is the background science. And so the way to do that is to collect this in a registry. And the last thing is there's particular attention in the final report to the issue of whistleblowing, When that science was reported in 2018, it was almost a surprise to some. And so the issue is, how do you encourage people to bring this forward? And in that context, the most recent announcement was in April of this year, where a clinic in the Ukraine said that it plans to sell CRISPR technology for what? Something really important: hair color, skin, and breast size. So that's the teaser. I hope you look forward to the final report.